right, so welcome to Turn Week, Tuesday night, 6 o'clock headliner with me, Kristen Kasanovich, Director of Turn, and Brian Thorstensen, one of the Turn faculty partners and fellow artists here and colleague at Santa Clara University. This is called Protest and Perception in Performance, and the goal is for us as artists and you as artists and audience to be in conversation about theater, choreography, and just thinking about the different themes of the climate crisis, approaching science communication from a whole different vantage point than it is typically communicated from. Science communication normally happens by environmental scientists when it comes to the climate scientists, engineers to some degree, activists to some degree, and the way the arts play out in that isn't always prominent, isn't always centered. And it's not that the arts themselves could solve the climate crisis. For example, if we could solve it by singing, then I think we would have done that already. But the arts have this way of perpetuating, what is best in our human spirit, what is most soulful, what is most connecting, and kind of our original intent for being here, which is to create things as opposed to destroy things. So I like to think of art in its best form as kind of the opposite of destruction and violence and hurt, and as more of a generative, life-affirming, gathering that allows for imperfection, and it allows for chaos, and it allows for ups and downs, and that in fact it's made of all of those elements. So art helps us get away from some idea of perfection, even though we can have some perfect moments in art. We can find the perfect word sometimes, or we can find the perfect movement, or we can find the kind of perfect night out at the theater or playlist in our earbuds. But art isn't about that. Art is really about a process that leads to some kind of answer for us, a temporary answer to some really hard to grapple with questions. And what could be harder than solving the climate crisis? I can't think of a harder question. I can't think of an issue that is more extensive, more pervasive, more all-encompassing of all the justice issues that I've ever cared about, and that anyone could name, I guess. They all seem related to the climate crisis. They either caused it, promoted it, or are exacerbated by it. And so solving justice issues is something that artists have long been dedicated to. And that's one of the reasons I have Brian Thorstensen here, who's a playwright and poet and score maker and works with dancers, works with musicians, is that he has a really brilliant track record with teaching about social justice, and also making pieces that really speak to social and other kinds of justice. And then recently he created not his first, but a major work of his with students. It was a devised theater piece on the climate crisis called Pushing Into the Blue. So part of tonight will be talking about that, maybe listening to a bit, however Brian wants to lead us through that. And I'm thinking that'll be sort of like our middle piece. Before we do that, we're going to look at a piece of choreography that I made about extinction. When I learned about the sixth mass extinction, I had a reaction and kind of an epiphany. I was terrified and sad and angry and worried and nervous and disappointed and ashamed. And I think I felt every single emotion a person could feel when I found out that we are headed into the sixth mass extinction, meaning scientifically the definition of that is that extinction rates are at 100 times what they would normally be. So that's the definition of an extinction beginning, and that's why I say we're in the beginning of the sixth mass extinction. Now, this thing could be turned around quite a bit with biodiversity at the forefront of our thinking and our policy and our lives and our choices. But we cannot recover lost species. So the losses that we've already had of these fellow beings of ours are irretrievable. And no one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear that it's over with something that you now miss and love, and loved. But what we can do is look at all the species that are on that brink of extinction and realize that really it is in our hands. It's simply in our hands to solve all those problems. So I decided to make a dance about my own sort of ironic, I guess, perhaps ability to lament all these losses, but also be complicit in them to whatever degree I have been. Not that I'm a hunter or anything, and I can't fish because I cry if I try to fish. But I'm complicit in this by having eaten meat, by having used some chemicals in my life that would hurt insects, which are the food chain of life, and by doing various things that, or not standing up, by my apathy, by my sort of bystanderism, not standing up for species that were on the brink and kind of leaning into all I could do there. So I was realizing that I wanted to somehow, I couldn't really put it into words what I was feeling, but I wanted to create something about that. So we're going to see that dance tonight on video. It's called Zona. And those are kind of the two pieces of art that we're going to focus on it first. And hopefully Ania will be joining us. I'm really hoping she will be, because she has some really great pieces that she's made with her group Youth versus Extinction. If she doesn't join us, thankfully I have them back up there because I have some of her works. I've got links to her works. So before we look at anything or see anything or feel anything, Brian, do you have any words you want to share? Because I would like to lead us through a little like reflective exercise, but I'd love for you to, open up with what you might like to say. Open floor.
I think the thing that's resonating with me from what you just said, Kristen, it was something that came up when we were working on Pushing into the Blue at one point when I was working with a group of 4 students from really diverse backgrounds. And we were all online, and it was sort of the end of the year being all online. And we had a moment of, they had a moment, we had a collective moment of, oh my God, is this what we should be doing? There's so many things that needed to be attended to. George Floyd had happened, and the former president, and on and on and on and on and on. And I think students were feeling very vulnerable and overwhelmed. And it was at that point where I realized what Kristen just said, which was the climate crisis is the intersection of all of these things. And I feel like right now, artistically, it's kind of the only thing that we need to be addressing, because there's so many ways to address what it is doing and what we have done to our home. And I kind of realized that through this discussion and this back and forth that we had with my students, to know that the racial justice issues, issues of equity, issues, LGBTQ plus issues, they all have a road that lead right into the climate crisis. Yeah, I guess that's what I want to throw out to start with. And that I think the disturbance of it for me needs to be disturbed at the level of storytelling. And I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you. That's really fantastic. So I'm going to ask people to reflect on a question, and this is where I'd love to have, if you will, people come on camera just for a little bit for this first question. We'll talk about it, and then we can take to our own abodes. So if a couple people want to come on camera, I'll ask you a question, and then we'll talk about it. And the first question, I think I'm going to put this up on the screen so you can see it. Okay. So is anyone willing to pop on and be visible for a few moments?
Hi, Kristen. Just kind of relating to this, I thought you had a really good point of like the bystander effect and like how hard it is to break away from like lifestyle choices. Like, it's just one cup of coffee, but it's like so much plastic that we're wasting. And I think it's really hard to take yourself out of your embedded cycles and to like make active choices, and active reflection, I think, is really important to break away from like these dangerous cycles that we think are like harmless now, but then you like look at pictures and you just see pollution and all these plastic cups. And I think that active reflection through art and channeling that emotion is like super important. But it's hard when we're so busy. And again, you just think it's one cup of coffee, it's one fast food meal, but it's like so dangerous to like our environment that we live in.
Thank you for saying that. And that cyclical nature is something that I've really thought a lot about since last turn when we did it in April. And were you here in April with us?
I attended a few events last year.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. But since then, we decided to actually have a whole headliner on addiction and the relationship of addiction, substance abuse addiction, to the climate crisis, to behavioral addictions, and just what you're saying, the embedded cycles. That's such a great phrase. And so on Thursday at 4 o'clock, we have a headliner on addiction with a really great group of people. It's going to be quite extraordinary. I think it goes well with the arts headliners and the sort of social science, looking at the psychology behind the climate crisis. And that needs to be studied just as much as the engineering does of how to build wind turbines. Like the psychology of why we're not changing immediately all the things we could change. That's fascinating, right? So yeah, I urge you to think about it and do the hard thing of if you pull up to Starbucks and you didn't bring your reusable cup and they're not making a drink in a reusable cup, pull away and keep going where you're going. If you're biking or on your roller skates or maybe the car, the tractor, whatever, like whatever you drove to Starbucks, if you don't have the metal straw, then don't stop. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like that's what's going to teach us. That's it. We have to be our own little Pavlovian dog experiment, I think.
Yeah. And I also think that it speaks volumes that we're not changing as well about our psychology, and like just also like the way that the world's kind of programmed to like just keep going and keep moving forward.
Right. Alexis, do you have anything you want to add at the top here? Or you're just putting your camera on because you're just being sweet?
I had to answer a question from my roommate, so I didn't actually hear your question, but if you wanted to repeat it, I can try to answer for you.
Yeah, let's move into this first question. And this is a challenge for anyone that wants to answer it. In the arts, we talk about a backstory, and it's the thing that happened before the curtain opened, so to speak. It's the story that the character comes into the scene with. Because everyone has a history, right? And when you walk into a brand new class at the beginning of fall quarter, and the teacher says, here's how you do your linear algebra, right? Your backstory is with you, but it's not necessarily being called out or expressed at that moment. And it may take a long time for anyone to ever get to knowing what that is, and they may never get to know what that is, right? So your backstory is that thing you carry with you, whether someone's asking you what it is or not. It's just your reality of your life. It's the scene before you're seen. So if we want to look at now as like a starting point tonight, 6:20 p.m., as a starting point of like a new way of thinking for ourselves, or a new layer of a new way of thinking, because there's no like wholesale, October resolutions here. What's the scene before this scene? So tonight, as of 6:20, what do you expect, based on your knowledge of the climate crisis, that everyone's future will look like on Earth if we continue forward with business as usual? And I kind of urge you not to think of a film example of that. It's hard not to think of what cinema has put into your head about futuristic dystopia, not to think about like things that other people have created, but for yourself, are there any images that come to mind of what everyone's future will look like on Earth if we continue forward with business as usual? Does anyone have an idea of that? And just take a moment with that, and then just pop your hand up if you have an idea there. Yes, Brian.
The day when I woke up in San Francisco and the sky was orange, and it was orange all day long from the fires. Something I hadn't ever seen before. I think that's what it is.
Cool. Alexis?
I think for me, because it might have been Turn Week my freshman year, but I remember going to a talk about water and how we have set ourselves up to essentially run out of like clean drinking water. And it just like that if we continue on this path, there's going to be things like clean water and like just clean air to breathe that are going to be things that you need enough money to afford to be able to be in those spaces that have them, which I think is really sad.
Yeah. Anyone else? An image of what you see based on your knowledge? Continuing forward with business as usual. Iman?
I'm from Sacramento, which is the confluence of two rivers, the Sacramento and the American River. And it is a natural pattern to see some salmon carcasses along the riverside after the breeding season to some degree. However, an image for me is like a lot of that, and carcasses on the side, on the bank. That's something that came to mind.
Okay. So what I'm going to say is all of these could be the beginnings of a work of art. All of these images could be a springboard for a poem, for a song, for a dance, for a visual art, for a sculpture that would express, something of what you're sensing, why you chose that image, why you chose those words, right? And that's kind of where the artist starts, is this, there's some kind of backstory, there's some kind of image, there's some kind of future idea from the past going into the future, passing through the now. The second thing that actors think about a lot, and I guess playwrights too, but mainly actors, when they're trying to figure out how to enliven the words of a playwright, they're like, what's my objective? What do I want? Why am I coming on stage? What's my reason for even coming on stage? I asked my dancers that today, and they looked at me like, well, I'm a dancer, right? And I'm like, well, yeah, I'm a dancer. I go on stage all the time. But why? And it was kind of a hard question to answer as a dancer. But it's a good one to answer. Like, what do we want? What would the future look like if you were in charge of creating it starting now? So we need to have this image, I think. When it comes to advocacy work, we need to know what we want it to look like. And we need to have a really concrete idea of that. For example, does equitable decision-making at the university mean 50% of the people at the table are people of color? Or does it mean 75% of the people at the table are people of color? Like, we need an image of what we mean when we say an equitable decision-making model, right? And if we don't know what that is, then we might hire one person of color and sit them at that table, and it is nothing near 50% or 75%, right? So what would the future look like if you were in charge of creating it right now, along the lines of the climate crisis, obviously along the lines of not business as usual, but does anyone have an image of what that might look like? Let's say you had all the power in the world to create that. And this could be any of you that spoke or any other voices from people on the call. And if you would prefer, feel free to chat it too. That's totally great.
I see a world more focused, especially in countries like the US, more focused on collectivism over individualism, with a different system that is more inclusive and equitable, where there's more community. And I don't know, I didn't get into specifics, but that's like immediately what comes to my mind if I think of creating a new future, some central tenets of that.
Fantastic. So in Emily's world, which I kind of want to live in, we wouldn't have this individualistic paradigm that we have, that's quite prevalent in the United States. And even for cultures that don't start out ascribing to it, by moving here and living here, sometimes people lose that collectivism that they came with. Some people retain it. It's a struggle. But yeah, if everyone could go towards a collectivism, that's a great image for something that would be more lasting. Yeah. Okay, third question. When we know what we want and we're playing a role on stage, then we have to figure out what action we're going to take. So, if I want to, I don't know, steal someone's treehouse, and that's my objective, and I come onto stage with a history of failing at stealing other people's tree houses, but now my objective is to finally succeed at getting this tree house for myself, and I have to have an action to get there. I can't just stand still, right? So we can't just want something and not have an action. Even though we do want to think about it, we want to reflect on it, we want to be philosophical and ethical, we want to be still with how we meditate on things, and we want to contemplate. If that is the only thing we do, I do think we are moving things forward if we pray. But I think the combination of prayer and action is probably the most potent combination. That's my personal religious opinion. But what do we need to do to imagine and achieve this vision of a sustainable, livable, enjoyable, natural future? So what can everyone name an action that you need to do? And it might be because you went to a headliner, you got one fresh on your mind, but it might just be like, I heard about this. So let's each name one, and I will say what I need to do is, as an educator, you just use my platform as much as I can to reach as many people as I can about the message of the climate crisis and solutions. So that's my action. Emily, do you want to try one?
Sorry, Iman and I are in the same room, so sorry for the audio troubles. I guess an action that I need to do, I usually like to think large scale for sure, but something that I need to do quickly and next would definitely be to start composting at the new house that I'm living at. Great. Well, that's a small individual action. It's something that composting is really important for a circular economy and whatnot. So that's something that I definitely need to do.
Right. Brian, can you think of an action?
I started composting after last year's Turn Week, because I felt guilty that I wasn't doing it. I started doing it. I've been thinking, this is weird, I've been thinking a lot about clothes. Like the clothing that I'm buying, and do I need to buy any more clothing? And can I stop buying clothing? And where am I getting it from? And so that's been really on my mind.
That's great. I love that. Let's see. Alexis? Oh, we have two.
There's two of us. Oh,
awesome. Alexis Morris and then Takagi.
Okay. I think I just need to be more conscious in my decisions and the sustainability of the decisions that I'm making. I think it's really easy, especially as a college student, to opt into the more convenient, often cheaper choices, which are not always the most sustainable ones. So if I can find ways to make more sustainable choices that are within my range of ability to do so, then I should be doing that.
Excellent. Alexis?
I agree with both Alexis and Brian, and just like thinking more about like what I'm buying. Like, do I really need more clothes? No. And if I do, can I go thrifting, or can I go to a consignment store? Like, are there other options? Can I go to the store instead of ordering it online and getting all that package and plastic? And just thinking more about my shopping habits and how I can actually like do more good than harm in buying plastic and everything like that.
Awesome. Iman, I know this is hard for you, but can you think of anything that you could do on what,
I really am trying to be active of and continue to work on having less judgment and resentment when I come into a conversation about really anything. I think I have a bad tendency to, like, for example, the day or like the week after I watched Seaspiracy, I cut out fish, and then I would look at my housemates and be like, I can't believe you're eating fish right now. So I think remembering how recently I've kind of started figuring things out is really important to ground myself and to have conversations with people that go somewhere other than just a place of judgment. So
Nice. Beautiful. I love all these answers. And the last one we're going to look at is when you walk on stage and you know why you're there and you know what you're going to do, then we think about what's the obstacle. And that's kind of what makes life interesting, right? So, the obstacle, Iman and Emily are having, they're going to blow out our speakers if they're both on volume at the same time, right? So there's obstacles to what you want to do. There's always something in the way that you have to work around. And so what are the impediments to doing what we need to do? What do we hope to do? So what's getting in the way of this? And I think this we'll just take for ourselves as opposed to shouting it out. Like, is it myself that's the impediment? Is it society? Is it like social pressure? Am I afraid to tell my neighbors that they should plant milkweed so we can have butterfly corridor on our street, and they shouldn't use like the terrible nitrogen stuff on their lawn, and just like, am I afraid? Yeah, kind of. So like, what is the obstacle to spreading the information we know is right and to doing the things we know are right? And then what are the obstacles kind of externally too, like that seem very big? Like, for me, big fossil fuel is like an obstacle. I see this giant industry as an obstacle to our health and well-being and the future of the planet. I see certain think tanks and certain leaders of those think tanks, millionaire, billionaire types, that are obstacles to what I would call the common good. So, just thinking about that for yourself, realizing that if you don't name what those are, then you may not know where to put the pressure and exactly where to push, right? So there's always like this place in which you want to focus your energy on, but if you don't know what it is that's the obstacle, then you might not know exactly where to push. And then there's this other idea, which definitely is, hats off to Chinese philosophy. You don't always have to push straight at the obstacle. You can go around the obstacle sometimes, right? So that's this idea of not playing within the system, but going outside of the system, not even acknowledging the system and creating a new reality is also, I think, something that can be done when you have an obstacle. And I think that's a transition for me, I think, because that is what leads me to art. Is it something that's outside of a system? No one's asking for it. No one's saying you must make art today, Kristen, but I find this need to create something that's never been created before, that says something that I can't say in words, that says something that I haven't seen someone say in exactly that way. And so the obstacle of just trying to communicate is almost solved by art. Art is almost this thing that goes around what people think you're supposed to do. And, no one would have thought that like Brian would have worked on a devised theater piece for 8 months straight, or I don't know, 12 months straight, however long it took. They wouldn't have said like, was that the way you're going to communicate about the climate crisis? You're going to take 12 months with a group of people in a windowless room and with pieces of paper taped all over the wall. Like, is that how you're going to get around this thing? And sure enough, that's what produced this amazing work that we got to see last spring, which unfortunately we can't show the whole thing here, but we'll get a snippet of it. So this is these are kind of the questions of theater. These are the questions of character building. These are the questions that I think help position us as advocates. So, what do I want? What's my action? And then what is my obstacle? And then like, let's go do it, right? And doing it imperfectly, not knowing the outcome, that's probably very important. Is like to keep your eye on the big goal of expressing this, the big goal of making things better, and not spend every single day bean counting or tabulating whether we're getting there or not, right? Sometimes you just have to just put yourself in that marathon and just wonder if you're going to make it and just go for it, right? But do put yourself in. So I love the idea that art is participatory and it's invitational. It's process oriented. Sometimes it doesn't culminate in performance. It can just be so transformational just to make it. Cool. And so with that, I'm going to see if it works to share my screen to show you a bit of this dance. I also want to see if it'll work for me to talk over it a tiny bit. So let's give this a try. I tried to set all the high quality video sharing buttons, but we'll see if it actually worked. Are y'all seeing a black screen? Okay, I just want to jump ahead a little bit here. Let me play this and tell me if the music sounds decent or if it's jumpy. Good? Yeah? Okay, so we're going to watch this called Zona. It was done at the Louis B. Mayer Theater, which is right like next door to me. And I had an image of seeds from specifically the seeds inside of pine cones being planted and then sprouting into a forest, and then someone coming to chop the trees down. And then the person who chopped the trees down lamented that they chopped the trees down. And then this disintegrated and then turns back into animal life. And the animal that we worked with a lot in this piece were deer. And I didn't have the dancers literally pretend to be deer, but I've been observing deer my whole life, and I observed them very heavily the year I worked on this piece to get their rhythms and to get their kind of their sensibility. So I tried to find movement that was deer-like. And so you'll see when the dancers stand up and they kind of go like this. That's the beginning of the deer section. And it's just, we tried to capture like how deer just look at you and do stuff around you. And then a hunter comes and kind of clears those animals away. I don't like violence on stage, so I didn't have them come with like a prop gun or anything, but they just kind of clear those animals away. And then the hunter is alone and laments that everything's gone. Then we have the underwater ocean scene, which is a coral reef. And then the divers come. And you can kind of imagine what happens there. And then we have a little scene, which is really pretty abstract, but it's what I thought of as like the insect scene where there's like bees flying around and they just kind of get trapped. And then we kind of go into this scene that's all about humans just lamenting the loss of all of these things, the forests, the animals, the ocean health, and the insects. And so then it kind of just a very simple walking pattern of just like step, 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 step. And then it kind of builds. And then finally the cast is left kind of reaching into a void and seeing what they've done. And you'll see some things that we call motifs, which are little repeating gestures, repeating themes or shapes of the body that keep coming back. And that's one of the techniques of choreography, is to sort of find a motif, or of playwriting, to once in a while find a motif that's something that's just going to be, you kind of can't get away from those words or from that image or from that tone. So chat me if anything's not working on this, but let's give it a try and take a look. It's almost like being at the theater. curtain and everything. So I'd love any responses, reactions, anything you'd like to say, questions.
I really like the transitions into each piece. I was wondering like how you thought about that because there's so many on the micro and macro level of like the ecosystem that you're trying to get at. Can you tell me like how you came up with like the transitions?
That's a great question. I felt there were 4 sections in the music that could each handle, that would give me enough time to kind of have an exposition of one zone, if you will, one zone of creaturely life. And so I thought, well, I think I'll start with the smallest thing that's visible, which would be like a seed. And building the forest was just the first image I came up with, where they just roll all over. The seeds are sort of planted and then the forest is built. And then when that was chopped down, I sort of thought, well, like, I didn't feel like a need for another section on plants or trees. I felt like, okay, it's time to go to like animals or something like that. And the deer came mostly because the music felt like I was out in a meadow or in the forest with deer. It's just like that part of the music reminded me of being in the woods and coming upon like a big pack of deer or a family. And so we sort of decided that the chopped down trees would be like growing out of the ground and turning into deer. So there's something about this, you know, the cyclical nature of all of our elements and minerals and water and all the things we're made of, cycling into something else. So a rebirth in the midst of this kind of tragic situation. And then to justify the ocean scene, I kind of had to have it come from off stage. It just felt like to create an ocean, we needed a big lighting change. It was a little harder to see on the video, but the whole theater just went all blue green, and the smoke machine was on, so it was like blue green and milky, atmospheric for that. And I did picture this coral reef, this group of the 7, sort of like a traveling coral reef, and so it's a combination of images of things in the ocean that would actually sort of travel in schools, but also things that really rely on being in the right spot and not having anyone tamper with them. So it was maybe more the life of the reef, you know, the anemones and things that would be found in it, jellyfish even. Like there were so many images that the dancers came up with on that one. And then when they're pulled out of that, the transition there was, I just told the lighting designer, I said, "Do you know what happens when coral dies?" And he's like, "Yeah, it goes white." And I said, "Yeah, can you give me white light at that point?" And so he made all the light white. The spotlight just goes white all of a sudden. When the divers come back a second time, there's nothing left, because whatever they did to it was enough to break it down and make it lose its momentum. And then again, the music kind of led me to the insect section. I wasn't sure what would the 4th zona be, but I sounded kind of like bumblebees and dragonflies to me. So I tried to create sort of something very sprightly, where these little sprightly things are moving around and they just kind of just get confined and they just kind of melt down. It's not like a giant climactic ending any of these things have. It's more just like dwindling or dissipating or sinking to the ground. And then the humans just kind of, so to speak, like when the dancers were humans, then I just used very pedestrian movement there at first, just steps, but with this kind of weird opposition in the arms and this like looking around and kind of a flatness. It was actually a hexagonal pattern. So everything was in 6s. We just thought with the 6th mass extinction, we'll make everything in 6s. And that's just a underlying spine kind of thing to the piece that doesn't matter to the meaning for the audience that much, but I think it matters. So that part really was where they turned into humans. And then they kind of got swept up and swept up and swept up into this accumulation of people reaching. And the stage was very barren. It's hard to see it on the video because the videographer goes in close on the dancers reaching at the end and doing this. But the whole stage was like icy, blue-white, it was cold. It was like nothing like what you had seen all along with these greens and browns and golds and things like that, the hues that we had seen. It just was, I told Derek, like the lighting designer, just make it scary and cold. And he did. So those are kind of how some of the transitions work. The music led me in terms of how long a section would be. And each section had to have time for the person to cause the harm, and then also show the audience the lament that there's regret there. But the regret is so, like, in art, in this piece of art, it comes so fast after the act. There's no delay, and that's what's interesting about art, is like you can cram time, you can cram temporal events that would normally be really far apart from each other into one thing, right? So like at the end of life, if you're, let's say God willing, you're 95 years old and you're at the end of your life, and you have a flashback to your life, and you're like, oh, I wish I had not done that. Right? Art can kind of like make the moment where you did it wrong and the moment where you have the lament really quickly close together. But it's almost like a whole life review when people go like this. It's almost like they're doing a whole life review of everything they've ever done. It's a confession, and it's a shameful moment. Yeah. So great. That's a great question about transitions. Any other thoughts about that before we go to our next piece? Okay, well, I feel that we should move to Brian's work and focusing in on this beautiful piece called Pushing into the Blue. So Brian, you have the full half hour or 20 minutes or whatever you want to do with sharing that. Yeah.
Thanks for, gosh, I just feel like I could watch that again and again and again and again and again. It makes me so happy to see that. I think I'm going to go in just into a couple of places in the script. And I think I'm actually going to go in, inspired by Kristen, into one of my obstacles right now in terms of teaching and also in terms of being a playwright. So I made this piece last year that Kristen mentioned called Pushing into the Blue. It was a device piece, which meant we started with no script at all. I worked with 5 students, 4 of which performed the piece. The title came from a New York Times article talking about the wildfires in Australia at the beginning of 2019 that were so big that the smoke was creating its own weather patterns, and it was punching into the atmosphere. So I shifted that from punching into pushing into the blue. So I mentioned that partly because a couple of the things that I want to show you, and sort of to dovetail off of what Kristen's talking about, is how we're using science as prompts, not pretending to be scientists, because I'm not at all, but we were using it as ways of entering into the material. So there was that. That's where the title came from. And I guess that one of the things, and I'm actually gonna put this into the chat. Actually, I'm gonna do. So I teach playwriting mostly, and playwriting traditionally in the West is based on Aristotle's Poetics, which is 2,000 years old. And several years ago, probably 8 or 9 at this point, I decided to put this question on the table: what is a play? I just decided to pretend that I didn't know what it was anymore. And one of the things that I came across when I was doing that was this article called Why I'm Breaking Up with Aristotle by Chantal Bilodeau. And this is an obstacle for me, and also a learning edge for me, which is why I'm offering it up. And she is a Canadian playwright and also climate activist, was one of the people that led the arts action at the Paris Climate Conference. And she says that we need to start telling our stories in a different way, because stories based on an Aristotelian model are inherently based on a power structure that is has outlived its usefulness and is actually destroying the planet. And she says this: power and wealth live at the top in the hands of a minority, while the majority exists at the bottom to support the top. This is how religions are organized, how monarchies thrived, and how today's capitalist systems functions. And this is many of you have seen this. This is a really traditional story arc, right? So one of the things I'm really interested in is, how do I get rid of this? Because I'm a storyteller. My entry into thinking about the climate crisis is through collecting stories. And then how do I arrange those stories? How do I score those stories that don't look like this, that aren't creating a similar kind of structure that the climate crisis is caused by? So that's one of the things that's really been on my mind. And I feel like I'm constantly digesting this. It's really hard to get away from Aristotle. We are so used to him, to this beginning, middle, and end, to this rising action and this falling action. So there's that. And I wrote this down while Kristen was talking. We have an attachment to Aristotle as a way of storytelling in a similar way that we have an attachment to our Starbucks coffee or our J. Crew sale. That's my attachment. Or our Sunday steak. We're still attached to telling stories that way. So so there's that. So we made this piece, and I decided from the beginning that we would not be telling one story. We decided to use the 4 elements: water, earth, fire, and air as containers. And those became kind of a thing that would hold sets of stories inside of them. And the piece ended up being just a little under an hour, and traversed a bunch of different territory, from stories that we found out in the world to stories that we found inside the people that were in the piece. So this combination of the personal and the political, which to me is a really potent space. Like, that's the space that I'm always wanting to navigate as a playwright. So I'm going to read one thing, and then I think I'm going to show you a few things just in terms of how we took some of the stuff from the world and put it into the piece. It was the first piece that we did at Santa Clara that we used this OBS software, and we were pushing from Zoom into something else. So some of the quality of the recording is not so great, but because we were learning a bunch of stuff. But this was the opening monologue, and I just have decided that I'm going to read it. It's a scientist named Dr. Zal. And I think it's fairly self-explanatory. And then I'll talk a little bit about that. And this piece was written by one of our lead writer, Kyler Juarez. It started with snow. Growing up in the Finger Lakes, the snow became my world. Sometimes I buried myself underneath it, allowing the cold to chill me to the bone. And while I laid under my snowy blanket, I'd look up at the clouds. I imagined what it would be like to merge with the atmosphere and observe my home from above. I needed to know what my corner of the earth looked like from space. Fast forward 1985, I start working for the CIA. Well, let's just say I vanished into the CIA. Back then, all anyone ever thought about was war. Consumerism was on the rise. America was falling behind in the space race, and the economy was crashing. Going back as far as 1960, we'd been launching spy satellites, one after another, orbiting the Earth, chopping into bits, zeroing in on dangerous locations. They could get close enough to spot the dust on a license plate. Then, 1991, and the Soviet Union disintegrates. Now what? Well, one day, as I watched the satellite roam the Earth, something caught my eye. All the snow was disappearing. The tips of the earth were receding to the center. We were so focused on license plates and nuclear testing sites that it slipped right under our radar, and all those memories of snow came rushing back. Then unexpectedly, I got a push from Al Gore. He was just senator then. He asked the agency to repurpose our satellite, our data, our images, some of it now over 30 years old, repurpose it all and start spying on climate change. They put me in charge leading a team keeping track of rising sea levels and carbon emissions. I worked day and night. I was fascinated, and I couldn't tell anyone. Until now that I'm retired, now that the program's been retired. There are always people who told me I wasted my time or ignored what we found. But I keep thinking, what else could we repurpose? So this is a real person. This was a real activity that actually happened, that the CAI did. And part of the reason why I wanted to take you in at this point is that this opening monologue ends with a question. And those are the kind of the important things to me. The other thing that's sort of my guiding post as a playwright is this quote from Carol Churchill that playwrights don't give answers, they ask questions. And then she goes on to say that we need to find new questions, and to find those new questions, we need new forms to be able to answer those questions. Which again then takes me back to Chantal Bilodeau, which is how do we want to be telling stories to ourselves right now? Because to me, stories are what help us make sense of the world. Then the form of what the stories will help us make sense of the world in a different way. Yeah, so that's the opening of that. I'm going to show you. I'm going to bop around in here a little bit. We'll see how this works. Let me get. God, you would think after all this time I would know what I'm doing. So I will just go on and read a couple more other things. But I will tell you a few things that landed in the piece. I started collecting stuff sort of actually about a year before we made the piece. And so, for example, in the section on water, there is a sound that runs between the scenes. And that sound is the sound of the high water sirens that go off in Venice when Venice looks like it's going to flood. So I used that as a transition. I don't tell people what it is, but it is a sound of the climate crisis that is in the piece. In the fire section, there is a video of a fire plane flying and dropping fire retardant on the ground, sort of going across the screen and leaving this purple streak. And it was from a fire in Southern California. It was news footage, and we put that into the piece without any sound underneath it on purpose, because so often my experience of wildfires has been being stuck in my apartment in San Francisco. I can't go outside and it's quiet. So that was the way that we were sort of using the science to put into the piece. Things like that landed in here. So I think I'll give you two pieces. Kristen, the lovely way that Kristen reminds us to be generous and compassionate, asked us to end on a hopeful thing. So I'm going to end on a hopeful thing, but before I do that, we're going to go someplace that's not so hopeful. This is just in terms of the arc of the personal and the political. This was a personal story that came out of one of the members of the group. When I was 8 years old, I got to visit Disneyland for the first time. I was so excited. I remember skipping through the park at midnight as the gates closed. My excitement never wavered, even as I stepped into my hotel lobby. Normally, at that age, your parents have to pick you up, or in my brother's case, drag you up the stairs. As I got into bed that night, I clutched the new Belle doll I got at the Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique. That's the actual name. Look it up. As I lay sleeping, an alarm sounded above my head. The beeping jolted me from my sleep and echoed in my ears. Smoke crept under my doorframe and grabbed at my throat. The entire room became this misty, saturated mess. My brother started wheezing, so I hustled him out of bed and out the door. I had done fire drills before, but I never thought I would be going through a full-on fire in a 50-story hotel building in the middle of Southern California. Luckily, we got out in time. I watched the flames of the upper floors devour the building. Then they began to engulf the lower half of the lobby. My father was on the phone yelling at someone as the firefighters pulled up. They threw water on the flames and cautioned us to step back. Poor Dad was in boxers in the middle of a parking lot at 2 a.m. in Disneyland. He already had it rough, but I guess I felt the need to bug him. Dad, what happened? He looked at me, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and said, "It got too hot today, honey. There was a burnt fuse. Heat. The heat caused it." I looked at our hotel again. Heat. California is known to be hot, but that night in the parking lot of the happiest place on earth, I saw for the first time what heat could actually do. So the piece kept swerving back and forth between these sort of drops into these really personal stories that people had written, and then these places that we were sort of looking out into the world. This, when we were making the piece, was when they had that cold stun in Texas, and all these sea turtles were washing on shore, and I was just devastated by that. So we wrote a set of scenes about that, and then we ended with this. When you're making a device piece, you're usually starting with a question. Mostly you're trying to get to a more specific question at the end, not necessarily an answer at the end, but the question that we started with is, what is happening to our home? And what is happening now? And what is happening now? Partly to keep us in the present moment, about that. So this idea of home was woven through the whole piece. And at one point I asked them to write a ritual poem, which is a very loosely structured formal structure where you have a numbered list that is usually a set of instructions around home. And this was what came out of it. So this is a piece that lives somewhere else, not the political and not the personal, but this other space, both formally and linguistically. And it's called Build a Home Ritual. And this was the end of the show. All of them were a piece of music that underscored it, and there was a picture of the globe in the middle of them. And they took turns doing this. But this is that, I'm hoping maybe a little moment of hope at the end. I think you can imagine in your mind that once this ends, the four of them who are in four corners of your screen start looking up. The globe fades away into a blue sky. That's what happens. Build a home ritual. 1, find an abyss. 2, lay a foundation there. 3, Plant your heart in the soil, 2 feet below the surface. 4, build upwards. 5, kiss the sky, anticipation. 6, allow the ivy to wrap its arms around porch. 7, let the sun pour itself into. And the into doesn't have a period at the end of it. And so let the sun pour itself into, and then there's this lifting up of the faces. And the screen becomes blue, pushing into the blue in a different way. So that we were actually sort of feeling that at the very end of the piece. Yeah. So a little bit about what we did. I'm sorry that I couldn't share. This is the first time I've Zoomed from my office. So I didn't know I had other things. I thought I was all set. But I'm happy to talk any questions or thoughts or insights. Oh, thank you. Anything else you'd like to know about the piece or?
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's lovely. That last piece of just so uplifting. It's such a ritual, and it feels kind of like someone digging themselves out of a hole and working their way through something. It's really neat. I want to thank Brian and everyone for joining us. And so for those of you that need to scoot out, I wanted to put a couple links in the chat, but feel free to hang out as well. If you want to say hi, thanks, Kula. If you want to say hi, we're here. If you want to come and just say bye, we'd love to see your faces for 2 seconds. But the last link here that ends with S8 is post-turn event survey. And that's really helpful. And then those of you that really want to just kind of start into the world of climate activism, we have this app that we're promoting called Climate Action Now. And it sends you messages every day of little things you can do every single day. Really nice for organizing our thoughts in this world. And then at 8 o'clock, so you have 39 minutes to get a nice dinner. At 8 o'clock, if you're on campus and you have an SCU ID, you can go to the Kenna Trellis by the Kenna building and meet Iman and Emily, who've been on this call. Thank you, Iman and Emily. And meet them and have a little thoughtful reflection hour. And they're going to lead you through some really cool advocacy steps after talking about your experiences with today's Turn headliners. And I think I'll be there for a bit tonight. I think I'm going to wander over. Maybe Brian will come with me. And then the Zoom version is also available. If you want to just go do it on Zoom, that's available too. So thanks so much, Amanda. It was so nice to have you here. And Alexis, thanks so much for your participation. It was really fabulous. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. And I look forward to watching the substance one. I have class, so hopefully it's on Zoom.
Yes, eventually it'll be on YouTube. I'm pretty sure. We'll see.
Okay.
It depends on what the group decides.
Okay.
But that'd be cool if you could make like the end of it or something, but maybe classes completely. Yeah, is it a 3:40 class?
Yeah.
Yeah, then it's not going to work. But if it comes out, then you can look it up on our YouTube channel. But thanks a lot for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this together. I really love all the headliners that I can attend.
Thank you. And are you an artist too, Alexis?
No, I'm more of a researcher, but I love using data to make art as well. And I also went to the middle college program, and a lot of the things that we did was art. So instead of writing an essay, we could do really cool paintings and poetry and performing arts pieces.
Oh,
so I loved that.
that is so neat.
Yeah, it was really cool.